I'm going to talk to you about color. This talk is, I realized it's very heavy in implementation. So if you've not used Designer, I'm very sorry, because this is very much how, like, node by node. I did have a section here going through, like, to introduce myself, but we've kind of already done introductions, so I'm actually going to just skip a few of these slides. But yeah, I'm now with the Stockholm Ubisoft office. I'm a material artist there, and I'm focusing on sort of pipeline tools and, of course, materials. Yeah, I do a lot of work in Substance now, and you know, even though I spend most of my day in Substance, I still do it at home. And yeah, I do quite a lot of stuff at home, and I like to get involved in the community and like make tools and stuff. Over the last year, I've been doing quite a lot of research into kind of color development and making variation and such, and trying to find a simple way of to the whole process and do it in a procedural way. So I had actually been documenting my progress on ArtStation, but recently I was lucky enough to work with Allegorithmic on a signature series. So that really, it was an opportunity for me to kind of put all of the work that I've been doing like in a proper test environment, and I really learned a lot from doing it. So all the materials that you're seeing here are like built using the color method that we're going to go through today. So this talk is pretty much more or less the journey that I've taken over the last year. And of course, while I don't think this is a final solution by any means, I do think it is quite a nice workflow, and hopefully I'm going to be able to convince you guys as well. So we'll first start by going through some common approaches to just building color in Designer, and I think this is going to be familiar to a lot of people, but I want to highlight the pros and cons for each, and then I'll show you like the approach of like where I currently am with this research, and hopefully present something that's simpler. After that, we'll spend a bit of time talking about like good gradient values and UX with Inside Designer. And then we'll finally go through the development of two particular nodes that is kind of the result of all this research. So let's begin with the common approaches. I think without a doubt, gradient maps are probably everyone's favorite. These are really good because you can get lots of colors from them, and you can take the samples either directly from reference or even directly from scans. And like typically you layer them together and you kind of progressively add more detail, and you can get some really nice results this way. But the problem is they're very hard to control. It's really easy to create a lot of noise. And you have this problem of like, how do you go about layering them? The blend modes, there's a lot of different modes. They're all kind of awkward, and they're very dependent on the color coming in. You also have this other issue of like where and how are you generating these gradient inputs? Like, does it come from height data? And if it does, what happens if that data changes? Like, the gradient maps are going to produce different results. This also extends to like typical noises. These are randomized with the random seeds, and of course, if you have any values that are dependent on that, they're also going to be changing your color. And in reality, to get enough detail, you actually need quite a lot of these. And worst yet, you can't expose any of the information to the user. It's not very procedural tool, and yeah, if you want to make any kind of color modifications, it's very difficult. So the HSL nodes, the other kind of very common result. Now these are really good at kind of broad color changes, but that's really about it. I really don't like these nodes. And I think here you can see why, like what color is this? And also they're very sensitive. Even a value of 0.05 has huge changes in the perceived color. And if you start introducing them in the middle of like your node chain, you just further compound the problem of unusability and you end up in this kind of uncontrollable mess. So the uniform color nodes, on the other hand, these are much better. You know exactly what color this is. Everyone knows how to use them. They're very familiar. And again, you typically layer them together in much the same way as you do with the gradient maps. But they have the same problem of, as good as they are, you still need a lot of them in order to get enough detail. And unlike the gradient maps, you need quite a lot more. And how do you then go about exposing this to the user? Like here, I've just got 4. Do you expose all 4? What if you need 10 or 20? Like this can get really messy. You still have the same problem with the kind of gradient inputs. Like where are they coming from? Are they dependent on height? Are they dependent on random seeds? So can we find like a simpler approach to all this? As I kind of explored this topic, it's led to the development of these 2 nodes, and we're going to go through both in detail later. But I wanted to start with just showing you what the node does and like where I ended up landing. So it takes a single exposable color uniform input, and then it lets you input dedicated value and hue variation maps as well as a blending mask. We can ignore these for now. We're going to talk a lot about them in the next section, in the kind of values and UX part. But the goal was to provide like a robust and simple way of handling color. So I've exposed some variation sliders, but it's still based on the exposable uniform color. So what you're seeing here is how you can just create value variation from that single input. It also lets you control how much hue variance there is. So you can just blend in some different hues. And since the hue variation is based off the original color, there's also a slider to control how much to offset from the original color. And because this is all based off that single color input, it means that it fully respects the saturation. So if you have low saturation, you're not going to get much color variation. But of course, you may choose to preserve the saturation or not, because sometimes some colors look really good when you're blending in some different variations. And in this case, I've chosen to expose soft light. I found that soft light for a lot of colors produces some very nice results. But the most important thing that I've tried to do here is have a procedural approach to it. So there is, you have the ability to find how many samples to take color and hue variations from. So when you have low sample counts, you only get 2 different colors, and then you can go up to a maximum of 16. So we'll shift gears a bit and talk about these gradient values and how this kind of relates to UX when you're working in your graph. That's these guys that we're going to talk about. So all of these inputs are essentially some combination of noises and height data gradients. So we need to really work out and define like what makes a good gradient input. So firstly, it should be adjustable. You don't want too many sliders, but you need enough to be able to control what you're doing. And it should be reliable, meaning that it's not going to drastically change your output when you randomize the graph. And it should be predictable, meaning that it's not overly sensitive to change and everything behaves in like a linear fashion. So there's some basic concepts that we should have in mind moving forward. So firstly, like you are the user of your own graph. You have to work in it, and you're the one who has to implement all the feedback that you get Like if your graph is messy or if it's difficult to use, you're going to be really slow and not actually want to make the changes. So for this reason, you should consider yourself as the end user. So you want to optimize for UX above everything else. If you have too many parameters, everything's just uncontrollable. If you don't have enough, then you can't really be flexible. So as you're working, you're constantly changing stuff, and you need to know how the graph is going to react. And in my opinion, it's better to have like a slower setup if it means that you can quickly and easily iterate. And of course, unless you're doing real-time integration, like all of this will get baked into textures anyway, so speed should be secondary. And of course, you want to keep it simple. This is a great quote. I think it's from Einstein, I believe. But everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And by this, like some things are inherently complicated, and that's okay. They need to be, but what you expose to the user and the interface you use to manipulate the system should be as simple as you can make it. So I mentioned earlier, like linear fashion. So I want to clarify what I actually mean by that. So if you imagine here, this is a representation of a slider, perhaps in the UI, that goes from 0 to 1. So what we have here is as you're transitioning through the input, you want it to feel predictable. And this is a really good example of that. It's just a linear progression. So a value of 0.5 directly correlates to halfway through the slider. This slider on the right, however, is now heavily weighted. So you can see that it's incredibly sensitive on the low values, but as you increase to values close to 1, it becomes very sluggish. And it just makes the slider feel unresponsive and not very predictable. So ultimately, what we're looking for is an even spread of 0 to 1 values. And of course, there's many ways you can go about manipulating your data to achieve this. But these are the nodes that I use like all the time. So if the levels node, for example, is really good if your data is independent. And by independent, I mean that it doesn't rely on like some previous part of the graph, and you can be sure that the ranges of values you're working with, they're going to stay relatively the same when you're randomizing. So the level nodes then lets you remap that data and to give you a much better distribution. And you can see in the histogram graph, we now have a much cleaner distribution of 0 to 1 values. If your data is dependent, meaning that it is relying on an earlier part of the graph, you then can't be sure that the data coming in what state it's going to be. So you can use the auto levels instead as a way to just fill out the full range. So sometimes you want to remove like low frequency in your data, and the high pass is really good at doing that. And if you have data that's kind of very narrow and sort of spikes in the histogram view, the curve node is really good at like broadening out that spectrum and just using more of the range. So as I mentioned before, like a common problem is the whole random seed changing your gradient information. So if you need to maintain control of what your values are doing, you need to look to remove the seed dependency. So for example, here we're using a Clouds 2 to drive a gradient dynamic. And notice that when we change the random seed, not only is the output changing a lot, but the range that the values sit in is also shifting. And you can imagine that how this would be a problem if your setup is dependent on the specifics of those ranges. Luckily, though, it's very easy to fix. You can just simply set the random seed to absolute on any given node that's causing a problem. So when you're building your gradient data, it's also good to think about things in terms of scale. You want a good range of detail for which you can use to colorize with. You saw this material from earlier, and it actually had a total of 5 gradient inputs created, used for the color. 4 were actually used to drive the color nodes, and 1 was used to blend between 2 colors. And these are the 4 color inputs. And I hope you can see what I mean by a range of scales now. Like we've got these large features in the form of the pattern shapes, then these kind of soft gradients, which within each pattern that kind of fades towards the center. And then we have some medium-sized noise, which is closely correlated to the height data. And finally, some like high-frequency detail. And if we go back to the render, perhaps you can see those gradients in the color now. So without question, like most people build their color from the height data. So do we really need to build, depend on the height data to build good gradients and masks? Well, yes, I think we do. I do think it is the best way to go, but not directly. So let me explain what I mean by that. For example, this is part of the graph from the material you just saw. Along the top here, we've got the height data running along the horizontal. And underneath is where I'm building up my gradient inputs for the color. But you'll notice that I'm not actually using the height data directly, but rather I'm using the kind of I'm using it indirectly by using the feature information itself. And if you think about it, like what would happen if we were to use the height map directly and then you decide that you want to reduce the intensity of the damage? Well, then, all your gradients would change and therefore your color would change. Maybe this is what you want, but I found that in most cases, it's probably not. And it's usually better to kind of reduce these nested independencies where possible and keep things separate and independent of each other. What then if you do actually want to use the height directly, which is usually the case if you've got curvature or AO nodes? Well, then you want to remove the dependency and have an independent, like normal nodes or a dedicated AO node. And maybe you want to auto levels depending on how you're set up. But that way, if the user changes the normal intensity for the overall graph, it's not going to change your color. And I think this is a very good example of what I mean by optimizing for UX over performance. Like adding these extra nodes is of course going to increase compute time, but it means that your graph is going to behave a lot more robust. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about how all this data, how you can blend all this data. So remember what we're trying to achieve is kind of linear behavior with predictable results. So I think it's really important to understand what is actually happening when you're using the different blend modes. So let's take the most simple of examples. It's a linear gradient with copy blend mode. And actually this is no blending at all, right? It's just a standard crossfade. But if we look at the function graph on the right, this is the kind of behavior that we want. When the input is 1, the output's 1. When it's 0.5, the output is 0.5. And you'll notice in the histogram view, we've got a completely even distribution of values. When you blend and multiply, you darken the image, right? So if the top input is 0.5 and the bottom input is 0.5, the output's actually going to be half of that. Well, now your curve is distorted and it's nonlinear. Most of the range is spent in the low values, and worse yet, the amount of offsetting from the original line, it varies depending on where in the range you are. So this behavior is just entirely inconsistent. Screen is just the invert of multiply, so it just brightens the image instead of darkening. So it behaves the same except on the other end of the range. Overlay then is a combination of both. If your value is below 0.5, then it's going to use multiply. If it's above, it will use screen. So basically, these blend modes are unreliable. The amount your value changes is inconsistent, and it's relative to the input. It's not like we're simply subtracting the same amount everywhere, like along the function. The amount's changing all the way along, and perhaps this is what you want. These modes do guarantee that the values remain within 0 and 1, which is really good if you're blending like roughness information, for example. But with height data, it's probably not. The app subnode, then, on the other hand, is completely linear. It's just addition and subtraction, nothing more. But I have noticed that not many people understand how it actually works. So what it does is it just takes this data and it adds it to this data. But this is remapped from to -1 to 1 first. And I can understand why people don't really like it. It is kind of awkward to use. So if you wanted to guarantee that your results are within 0 and 1, for example, you need to be reducing the input ranges accordingly, and that's quite a lot of management overhead. So this is where the weighted average node comes in. That was the first node that I developed, this one. So wouldn't it be nice if we could just take our data and blend it all together and not really have to worry about the different blending modes? So we could just take an average of all of the inputs just by adding them together and then dividing it by the number of inputs you have. So that's what the average blending node does. And then we could just weight that average by exposing an intensity per input. Now, not only do we have perfect linear blending, but we also have a way to control how much influence each input has on the final result. To me, this is really clean and a lot more user-friendly than kind of stacking nodes and managing ranges. So if we have a look how that's set up inside, first all we need to do is make sure that we're using floating point numbers, because otherwise Designer will cap the values between 0 and 1. So then I just add all that information. In this case, I assume a maximum of 6 inputs, and then just expose intensity sliders for each one. I then let the user just decide how many inputs they're going to have. I just divide it with a pixel processor, and then let the user decide if they want to normalize the result or not. And then the transform node just converts it back to the original bit rate. So to summarize a little bit of like where we are with this, we're still trying to define what makes a good input for some kind of arbitrary color solution. So we covered about how to manipulate manipulate your ranges to get a nice even spread of 0 to 1 values. We talked about removing the random seeds. Correctly using the height data, and how to go about blending all this information in a reliable way. So now we have a node that makes doing all of that really easy. And this gives us a good, reliable way of working with color information. So now that we've got good color gradients, let's move into the actual implementation of the color variation node. Which is the part 2 of the 2-part nodes. So I first started this journey by like trying to define what it was that we actually want. We essentially want a way of combining all the good things about these nodes and do it procedurally, and like package it up and expose some nice flexible parameters. So to clarify a little, like we know we want color pickers. We know we want HSL variation, and we know that we still want to use scan data. So let's take this one at a time. We'll first talk about the color pickers. Well, that one's actually pretty easy, right? You just expose the color picker. And then we can have all our color variation derived from that single input. So what about the HSL variation, but not with the HSL node? Well, okay, so essentially what you want to do is take your color, you want to add some random hue, some random value, and some random saturation. But actually, you don't want this to be random, but rather you want it to be based off the original color. And yeah, that's kind of hard. So, okay, let's tackle this one step at a time as well and try out some ideas. What about something like this? We've now got our color picker. We've taken 2 hue extreme variants, and then we just blend between them. It's pretty simple, right? This is pretty good, but it's only blending between two samples, essentially. What about if we wanted to blend between 4? Well, that's not too bad, but I can think you see where this is going. What if we had 10 colors or 20? This setup clearly is not going to work. But what you might have noticed is what we're essentially building here is a color chart. And HSL nodes are just color samples. It's the kind of color chart that you build when you're using the gradient map. This is great. It's exactly what we want. We can use it to drive the gradient dynamic. And in fact, we don't even care about the color. We only care about the value to offset the hue by. And if we wanted more samples, we just need to find a way to add more of these numbers. So we need sample points. And we can use the FX map to do that. And this is actually now the first part of the puzzle for the color node. So warning ahead, there's quite a bit of math, and it's very focused on implementation. So I apologize, but you don't need to follow exactly, only that I would like to show the concepts behind it. And I think there's also value in seeing how it's put together so people can replicate it. So inside the FX map, what we do is just place a sample, and it looks like this. The iterate node lets you loop through the number of samples that we're defining. And then the quadrant node is actually placing the sample point at each time. And this is what's inside the quadrant node. And all that's doing here is we're first defining the size of the sample. We then position it in the x coordinate. And then we assign a random value between 0 and 1. And that's it. We have our sample points. Now, 16 by 16 is actually the most efficient output size for Designer. So if we set the output size for the FX map to that, it gives us a maximum of 16 samples. And to me, that feels like a pretty reasonable number. The thing is that these samples might not actually be 0 to 1. We randomly generated them between 0 and 1, but that doesn't guarantee that they will be. So we should add an auto levels to ensure that they are. And now we can add our color. We can use those values to offset the hue. And the pixel processor lets us do this. So that's what's inside the pixel processor. What we're doing here is we first remap our random values to -1 and 1. And this is because we want to emulate the HSL node, right? And offset in both directions for the hue. We then scale that offset to give us a way to control the amount of offsetting from the original color. And actually, this scaler is then exposed to the user, but it's actually in two parts. There's one slider that the user will interact with, which ranges between 0 and 1. And then there's another scaler to determine how sensitive that slider should feel. We then just take our color, convert it to HSL, add in our random variation to the hue component, and then just recombine the vector and convert it back to RGB. What happens though if the hue drops below 0 or it goes above 1? Unfortunately, Designer doesn't automatically wrap the numbers back around for you, so all this junk here is just to do that wrapping. If the value is above 1, it will loop between 0 and 1. If it drops below 0, it will loop the other way, from 1 to 0. So this gives us a result like this, but there's actually another problem here. These color samples, they need to upscale at some point, right? Because eventually they're going to be used to drive gradient dynamic. And as this information upscales, it doesn't do a very good job of interpolating the values. Like what we get here is these kind of soft bands or strips where the samples were, rather than a nice blend between the samples. And this is because unless there were exactly 16, each sample point was occupying more than 1 pixel. So as it upscales, that relative space remains the same. So what we really want is linear interpolation between the sample colors and avoid these kind of blobby strips. So something like this, where we have perfect linear interpolation between each sample point, regardless of how many samples we have. And this is quite an interesting problem, I think. So we have a 16 by 16 map, and we can't guarantee the number of sample points, but we still need to produce perfect linear interpolation when upscaling. So there's 3 bits of information we need to be able to solve this. First, we need the relative size of the sample relative to the u-coordinate. We need the index of a given sample and the one next to it, so then we know where to actually sample the 2 values from. And then we need a 0 to 1 gradient running between the width of each sample so that we can then correctly interpolate between them. So we can use another pixel processor to do that. And I think now you can clearly see the difference between the interpolation methods. So this is how this was done. This is the relative sample size, which is simply 1 over the number of sample points. And then we measure how many of those little sections fit into the current position in X. If we round that up and down, we get the 2 adjacent sample indices. And when you multiply it by the sample size, now you have a coordinate for you to actually sample the random value from. If you take the remainder instead, you then get a linear gradient between 0 and 1 within each sample. Now actually this was done in its own separate function graph, and that was so that I could reuse this data elsewhere, since we're going to need it later. So to be able to access it, I just packaged it up into a single vector and set that as the output. So then in another function graph is where I actually do the linear interpolation. So this is the height, this is the data we just defined coming in. And then we can use the 2 u-coordinates to get the actual values that we're going to interpolate between. But we should first make sure that we actually sample in the middle of each index. So I just halve the sample size and add it to the u-coordinate, because otherwise, we will sample right on the edge, and you won't necessarily guarantee which value you're going to get. And then finally, we just lerp between the 2 random values. So that's pretty much it. We now have procedural hue variation in a color chart format. So we can use that to drive the gradient map. So at this point, there's a couple of other things we should think about. Like firstly, we need to decide how this hue variation should blend in. And secondly, what happens if the color doesn't have any saturation? Like what does it mean to vary the hue of something that doesn't have color? So clearly, we need to do a little bit of look development. So first and first, why don't we blend the color over the original and expose the opacity? Then we would have a control over how strong the variation is. And since some colors look really nice with different blend modes too, we can also then expose the blend modes. But what about then when the color has no saturation? It might feel weird to have a hue variation slider that doesn't actually do anything when you use it. So we should force the saturation of the color to 1 first before creating any of the variation. And that way there's always going to be some variation to blend in with. Now, we could use the HSL node to do this, but I found that the HSL color model brightens your color in really weird ways at high saturation, and I didn't want that. So what I wanted was the color to stay exactly the same and only increase in saturation. So the HSV color model can do this, but in order to use it, we have to use the pixel processor to access it. So inside here, that's what we have, and all it's doing is just taking the color, converting it to HSV, forcing the saturation to 1, and then converting it back. The thing is, maybe you do want to respect the saturation and keep very subtle hue changes. The point being with this is that you don't really know. So maybe it's a good idea to just let the user decide for themselves and expose a switch instead. Then all we need to do is just update the blend mode accordingly. So that was quite the detour, but now we've got a pretty good solution for our hue. So what about value then? Well, this is actually exactly everything we need. So we just need to make a grayscale version of the linear interpolation. Again, we can do that with the pixel processor. And because we exposed we had a separate function graph before, we can access that data again. Then we could map that color chart to another gradient input. So now we have hue and value variation being driven by two different inputs. And then we can just blend the two together. I actually found that blending the color with overlay on top of the value produced much nicer results. But this means then that if we want to control the amount of value variation, we need to use the range node instead. And this is because when this has no range, it outputs 0.5, which means the overlay does nothing. So the thing is, all this color work so far is more or less like color offsetting. It's not really color variation. To me, color variation means like you're blending in different hues and values based on the original color, not replacing it entirely with something new. So why don't we just blend in the original color back in and just expose a mask for it? Well, that one was much easier. So what about the saturation? Well, we could just reuse the sample data and offset the saturation exactly like we did with the hue and variation, the hue and value. But I actually found that the results looked kind of weird, and I preferred it without randomizing the saturation at all. So, well, that just solves that one. So what about the scan color data? Unfortunately, there just isn't a way to expose this information for now, so there's not a lot we can do about it. Except maybe you could offer some color chart presets as just a convenient way to get some quick color values that derives from scan data. And then you could expose all of this onto a switch and just let the user decide how they want to use the tool. And then that's everything for the color variation node. So let's look at how this all then comes together. So in practice, we actually have a pretty minimal setup time now and good flexible reliability. And because we've taken a procedural approach, we can drastically simplify how many color inputs we want to expose to the user. So a typical setup might look something like this. Here we just have, we've just exposed two color pickers. We generate all the variation and expose the parameters on the two nodes. And we still have a good way of controlling the final look and behavior of the color. What about blending between them then? Well, if you're not using this node already, then I think you should. It's really awesome. We've already spoken a lot about good 0 to 1 values already, and in this example we have gradient data that's based off the height with a bit of noise mixed in. And in fact, this is that fifth map from the material we spoke about before. But what the histogram select node lets you do is transition through those values. And because this is largely based on the height map, it essentially gives you a way of transitioning through 3D space. And to me, that's not bad for such a small setup. So to close off, I think there's a lot of flexibility in this setup. You can get some very subtle results, or you can go quite bold with it. And you can really create quite a lot of variation. In fact, these materials here just have two color pickers. All this color variation is derived from two colors. This example also only has 2 colors, but I did expose a third dirt layer. And then if you start to layer maybe 3 or 4 of these nodes together, you can get some very interesting color results. But remember the basic concepts that we started with. Like, you are the user of your own graph, so you want to work with a reliable and robust graph. And you do it by optimizing for UX above everything else. Of course, you optimize for performance, but a manageable graph is far better than a fast and uncontrollable one. And we try to keep it simple. While the setup underneath is quite complicated, the end result is now just 2 nodes that you just use with color pickers. So that's it, and feel free to mail me if you want to try out the nodes. They're all available online. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions.
Awesome presentation, thank you. What did you use to render your materials?
It's a marmoset.
Thanks.
Yeah, just to say thank you, and the material are really awesome. Like, the rendering is awesome, but the subtlety you get from those nodes is really crazy.
Thank you.
Yeah, just this.
Thank you.
And at some point, you also showed a graph, like a curve for the multiplication, addition, and stuff like that.
Okay.
Was it a snapshot you made inside Designer, or you reproduced the curves outside in a?
You mean for the actual graph?
Yeah, to see that.
No, this was from, I forget the website now, but just some function math website where it lets you input a formula.
Because I wrote a node in Substance Designer that is doing exactly that.
I know.
And it's pretty useful for debugging and seeing those kind of things.
But I didn't have it. I didn't have access to it when I was making this, unfortunately. But yeah, perhaps you can come over after and show me which slides you're talking.
Questions, anyone? Come on.
No, thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.